The first thing she said to me was not my title. She said, "The fire is too low. A man healing from a deep wound needs warmth, not ceremony." And then, before I could decide whether to be offended or astonished, she crossed my chamber, crouched at the hearth, and fed it 3 logs with the practical attention of someone who had done exactly this 1,000 times in 1,000 other rooms. She did not ask permission. She did not glance back at me to see how I was receiving the intrusion. She simply built the fire up until the chamber stopped feeling like a hall carved out of cold stone and started feeling like a place where a living person might choose to remain. That was the first night. I am telling you about it now because I want you to understand what she walked into before I explain what she gave back to me. For 2 years, Stoneholt had been quiet in the way that only happens when the person who should be speaking has gone silent. Not the peaceful quiet of a hold at rest, not the hushed expectancy before a ceremony, or the natural lull of an evening settling into night. The particular, leaden quiet of a thing suspended, held in the breath between one state and whatever comes after, waiting to find out whether it is still alive. I had not spoken in 2 years. The wound had taken my voice first, at the Battle of the Eastern Reach, during the 3rd hour of a ridge fight that should have lasted 1. We held the ridge, that much was true, and the pack had held it well, and I was proud of them in the way a king is proud when the cost of what he is proud of has already become too large to look at directly. We held the ridge, but the price of it was a blade that found me below the left shoulder at an angle no armorer's training prepares you for. It did not kill me, which my healers informed me should be considered fortunate. It found something deep in the layered muscle and sinew between the shoulder and the base of the throat, not the bones, not the great vessels, nothing that could be clearly located and remedied. And when the battle was over and we could finally attend to such things, it left behind a silence where my voice had been. Not a wound you could dress and monitor. Not an inflammation that would respond to treatment in the expected way. Something quieter and more absolute than that, more settled in its purpose, as though the blade had carried its intention all the way to the source of speech and put it out like a candle. My wolf went still inside me on the same night, as though the two of them, the voice and the wolf, had reached some private agreement about what the situation required. That was not the worst of it. The worst of it was that I remained entirely present. I was still Cairn of Stoneholt behind my own eyes, still capable of understanding everything that happened in my presence and forming responses I could not give. I watched every face that came through my chamber door with the same clear assessment that had served me as king for 12 years, and I understood exactly what I saw there. The worried tightening around Havard's mouth each morning when he arrived with the day's report and found me unchanged. The way the council members spoke in the corridor just outside my door at a volume slightly above comfortable. The particular volume people use when they want the person on the other side to understand they are being discussed, without the directness of actually discussing it to his face. The careful, exhausted kindness of the pack doctors, each of whom had tried everything within their considerable knowledge and come, each time, to the same careful and painful point of having nothing further to offer. 2 years of sitting in the chair by the window, watching the fog move through the mountain passes, thinking about everything I used to say and everything I could no longer say, and being watched in turn by a pack that did not know how to function around a king who had gone silent. My wolf did not stir in all that time, not for the doctors, not for the 3 lichen healers my steward Havard brought at extraordinary expense from the western packs in the first year. Not when my second-in-command, Bren, a man I had fought beside for a decade and trusted with everything I had to trust, came and sat with me in the evenings and talked enough for both of us, describing the pack's affairs, the season's progress, the small daily events of a hold that was running itself as best it could without its king at the center of it. Bren had a gift for this. He could speak about a trade dispute or a new pup's first shift with equal warmth and equal clarity, giving me the substance of Stoneholt's life in the evenings so that I understood I was still inside it, even in the silence. Even for Bren, my wolf did not move. Not even for the pack children, whose voices came through the stone on feast days like water finding its way through a crack. I had always had a particular fondness for the pack's young, had spent more time than was strictly required of me, as king, attending the pup runs and the naming days and the first shift ceremonies. They had come in the early months of my silence to the door of my chamber sometimes. I could hear them there, the quiet scrape of small feet, the occasional whispered conference. Havard had gently redirected them after a while. It was better, he said, for the pups not to see the king like this. I understood his reasoning. I agreed with it. That did not make the sound of their footsteps receding down the corridor easier to hear. I had begun to believe, in the second year, that this was simply what I was now. Not dying, I had no sense of approaching death, no particular physical deterioration beyond the silence itself, but fixed in place, present and unreachable and increasingly unsure whether presence without reach constituted anything that could honestly be called living. Havard came to me in the third week of the autumn of the second year with the expression I had come to know well, the look of a man who has something difficult to propose and has already decided it, is beneath both of them but can no longer find an alternative that sits better with him. He was a tall man, Havard, with the posture of someone who had carried heavy things for a long time and kept their back straight anyway. He sat in the chair across from mine. He was the only one who sat in my presence without asking, a small intimacy we had arrived at somewhere in the first month of my silence and never rescinded. And he opened with a careful preamble about the obligations of a king to exhaust every avenue in service to his pack, and the limitations of conventional healing science, and the various additional consultations he had attempted without result. I waited. "There is a woman," he said finally, "from the border valley at Ashfin, at the eastern edge of the pack's territory where the settlements run along the old river road." He paused. "She is not a trained healer. She has no standing from any recognized order. She is, in the terms the established healers would use, a hedgewoman. An herb keeper. She tends the folk in the eastern settlements, the ones too remote from the holds to make the journey for formal medicine." He set his hands flat on his knees, which was the gesture he made when he was accepting something he did not fully wish to accept. "She has a reputation among them," he said with careful precision, "for reaching cases that the trained healers gave up on. That is the specific claim. I have interviewed 3 of the settlement families myself, and I found their accounts consistent, and I am not, as you know, an easy person to satisfy on the subject of consistency." He looked at me. "I would not bring this to you if I had any other direction to go." I looked at the window. The fog that evening was so thick the mountains were entirely invisible. There was a version of Stoneholt in which this had all already resolved, in which the wound was healed, the wolf was running again. The silence had been a season and nothing more, a difficult passage between 2 periods of ordinary life. I had thought about that version of Stoneholt a great deal in 2 years. I held it in the way a man holds a belief he is no longer certain is true, but is not yet ready to relinquish. I looked back at Havard. I made the small movement of my right hand that had come between us to mean yes. He exhaled. It was a barely audible thing, the exhale of a man who has been carrying a weight and has just been permitted to set it down for a moment. "I'll send for her," he said. He did not know, when he said it, that he was sending for everything. She arrived on a Tuesday morning when the fog had not yet decided whether it meant to lift or thicken into rain. I heard her in the outer corridor before she came through the door, heard her voice answering something Havard said, a voice I had not heard before, unhurried and level, moving at the same pace and register whether she was speaking to a steward or, as I would come to understand, to anyone else. She did not heighten her pitch or slow her words. She simply spoke. Before she came through the door, I heard 2 other things. The council had gathered in the anteroom. Torvin and Aldrich, the 2 senior members, and the pack healer Moretti's, who had treated my wound in the early months with genuine skill and exhausted knowledge, and had apparently decided that her history with the case gave her standing to weigh in on whoever else attempted it. I heard Torvald say, not quietly, that bringing a hedge woman from the border settlements into the king's chamber was an act of desperation that reflected poorly on Stoneholt's standing, and that he wanted it noted he had advised against this from the first. And then I heard Moretti's say, with the particular sharpness of a physician whose expertise is being questioned by implication, what she practices is simple folk medicine, Havard. It may serve the settlements well enough. It will not serve the king. The nature of this wound is not something herbs and border remedies address. A brief silence. Then the woman's voice, still at the same even pace, still entirely itself, said, "I heard that. I don't mind. If you'd like to tell me what you've already tried, I'll make sure not to repeat what hasn't worked." A longer silence. Havard said with great restraint, "This way, please." She came through the door. She was not what they would have sent if they were trying to make an impression. Middle height, with dark hair that rain had done something honest and unaffected to. A gray cloak, clean but worn, the kind of garment that had been in all weathers and expected to remain there. Over one shoulder she carried a satchel of the type that opens at the top, the kind that holds more than it appears to. She had careful hands. I noticed that immediately, the way the satchel strap lay across her palm, the arrangement of her fingers around the door frame as she came in. Hands that had done precise work for a long time and had the particular look of hands that are confident in their precision without needing to display it. She looked at me, not at the chamber, not at the cold fire or the large chair or the stone walls. At me, the way she might look at any person she had been asked to help. There was no category of person in her looking. "Your fire is too low," she said. "A man healing from a deep wound needs warmth, not ceremony." And she crossed the room and built the fire up. I watched her do it. She crouched with the easy balance of someone who spent a great deal of time at ground level, and her attention was entirely on what she was doing, the angle of the logs, the draw of the chimney, the specific patience of building a fire that would hold through the night and not merely flare and subside. She did not look at me while she worked. She was building the fire. She did not need to do two things at once. When she was satisfied, she stood and turned to me, and she moved the smaller chair from against the wall and positioned it beside mine, not across the room, not at the differential distance people usually maintained, and she sat in it and opened the satchel on her lap. "You don't have to do anything," she said, taking out small cloth packets and arranging them on her knee. "I'm going to do most of the work. You've been holding yourself very still for a long time, and the last thing you need is another person who wants something from you in exchange for being present." She looked up from the packets. "I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do before I do it. You can object in whatever way seems right and I'll stop. Is that acceptable?" I made the motion with my right hand. She nodded. "Good. I'm going to start with the shoulder, where the wound went in. The surface is healed, I've been told that. What I'm looking for is what the wound left behind when it healed." She reached forward and set the flat of her palm on my left shoulder without ceremony or hesitation. Not probing, not the exploratory pressure of a physician mapping an injury, simply resting there, warm from the fire. Under her hand, under the old scar, under the closed skin and healed muscle, something pulled taut and then, very slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to release. Like a rope that has been underwater so long it has forgotten what it was before the tension, slowly remembering. She said nothing for a long time. Her hand did not move. She breathed quietly and her attention remained where her hand was, and I had the peculiar sensation, a sensation I did not have language for, that she could feel through her palm what I felt in the bone beneath it. That her attention had the particular quality of attention that reaches the thing it is attending to, rather than remaining on the outside of it. Then she said, very quietly, not to me exactly, or not only to me, there you are. And the space beneath my wolf, the deep quiet where it had gone, shifted. Something that had been entirely still for 2 years moved almost nothing, the width of a breath. She did not remark on it. She lifted her hand after another moment, untied one of the cloth packets on her knee, and began to talk. Not about me. Not about the wound or my silence or the question of whether what she was doing would work. She talked about the eastern settlements in the Ashfin Valley, the people she tended there, the small detailed particulars of lives lived far from pack holds and pack hierarchy. A boy who had been bitten in the river marsh and run a fever for 3 weeks before she found the right combination of meadow plants in the high summer growth. An elderly woman who grew a garden of particular stubbornness, specifically cultivated around everything Lyarth had ever suggested might help, so that nothing she needed was ever unavailable. A farming family who had kept her dinner and a bed for 3 winter nights and asked nothing in return because, as the farmer put it, she had kept his wife, and so everything they had was also hers. She told all of this without performance and without any evident aim beyond the telling. Her voice had the quality of a voice that is simply giving what it has to give, without management or calculation. Her hands moved with steady competence on the old scar's surface, applying what the cloth packets held with the confidence of long practice. Outside the window, the fog was beginning to lift. I could see, for the first time that week, the pale line of light along the upper ridge. I did not speak, I could not. But I listened, and something in the listening was different than it had been the day before, or the month before, or the long winter before that. There was a quality to the air in the room that I could not name because the vocabulary I had for things like this had been the private language between a lichen king and his wolf, and that language had been silent for 2 years. But I knew, somewhere below the reach of language, that the silence in the room had changed. It was no longer the silence of absence. It was something else, something that might have a different name. She came back the following morning. She came back the morning after that. She came every morning for 3 weeks, and this is the account of those mornings as I understand them now, from the other side of what they made. Each morning the fire went up first. She had a system, not elaborate but thoughtful, and after the first day she did not need to search for where the wood was kept or how the chimney drew. She simply built the fire with the ease of someone who has learned a room's particular mechanics and committed them to practice. Then the small chair beside mine. Then the satchel open on her lap. On some mornings she talked. On others she was quiet for stretches that would have been uncomfortable with anyone else, but that with her simply felt like the particular quality of focused attention she brought to everything. The quiet of someone who is working, not the quiet of someone who has run out of things to say. I learned the difference very quickly. I had become, by necessity, a careful reader of the tonal content of silence. She told me about the seasons in the Ashfin Valley, which were different from the seasons at Stoneholt, lower, wetter, the summers thick and green in a way that mountain summers never quite managed. She told me about the pack herbs that grew only in the eastern meadows when the frost broke, and how to find them in the dark by smell if you needed to, and which ones could be safely combined, and which ones never under any conditions. She told me about the people she'd lost over the years, not with grief requiring management, but with the plain acknowledgement of a person who had spent her working life in close contact with the limits of what could be healed, and had learned to carry those losses as one carries anything true about the world, without pretending it was other than it was. She was not performing anything. That was the quality I found most remarkable in those early mornings, because I had been performing for as long as I could remember, performing the authority, the certainty, the specific containment of a lichen king, and then for 2 years performing the silence itself, the stillness, the acceptance of an altered state. She came into the room every morning and simply was what she was, without any of the overlay that people construct for the benefit of others. The herb woman from Ashfin, in her clean, worn cloak, with her careful hands, building the fire because it needed building. And my wolf moved toward wakefulness. Not quickly, not in any of the dramatic ways the bond had always announced itself in the stories told about it, the sudden ignition, the immediate and overwhelming certainty, but steadily, the way a fire catches when the conditions are right. A degree at a time, a day at a time, the warmth arriving before the flame. Havard noticed the change before I could have named it myself. He had always been perceptive beyond his title's requirements, and he had spent 2 years reading me in very small increments, which meant he could detect alteration that would have been invisible to someone less practiced in the specific details of my stillness. The set of his shoulders changed. He stopped bracing himself imperceptibly each morning before he opened my door. He began to bring the day's report with something closer to his old manner, brisk, informative, even occasionally edged with the dry humor he had mostly suppressed for 2 years out of a misplaced consideration for my state. The council was less willing to revise. Torvin came to Havard in the first week and repeated his objections with additional conviction. The presence of a border herb woman in the king's chamber was unseemly. If word spread through the packs that Stoneholt had resorted to folk medicine, it would read as weakness. There was an implication in his framing that he did not make explicit, that the situation reflected not only on the hold standing, but on the likely permanence of my condition, that the resort to hedge remedies was the behavior of people who had stopped believing in a genuine recovery and were simply filling the days. I was present for none of these conversations. Havard reported them to me in the evenings with the even factuality he applied to all information of importance, without editorializing. He told me what Torvin had said and what Moretti's had said and what Aldrich, the youngest of the council, and the one I had always found most honestly minded, had said, which was simply that he hoped she was helping and that he did not, personally, have a view on the matter beyond that. I made the motion of my right hand when Havard had finished, which meant understood and nothing further. He said, "I am disregarding Torvin's objection. I want you to know that." I made the motion again. He looked at me for a moment. "She's doing something, Cairn. I don't know the mechanism of it, and I suspect she might not be able to explain it in terms Moretti's would find satisfying. But there is a quality to this room now that was not here before, and I notice it every morning when I come in." He paused. "I am sure that is not my imagination." I looked at him. I made carefully a slow nod, not my right hand, the specific gesture of acknowledgement, but my whole head, the larger thing. He sat with that for a moment. Then he rose and said good night and left, and I sat with the fire Lyarth had built that morning, still generous, still casting warmth into the far corners of the room, and thought about the quality of presence he had described, which I could not have named in words but recognized precisely. On the 9th day, she did not talk for almost an hour. She worked quietly, and I sat beside her and did not feel the need to fill the silence, and after a while the quiet in the room was the very specific quiet I have tried to describe, not the silence of absence, not the loaded silence of something being withheld, but the silence of two people who have enough trust in each other to stop performing the work of filling it. I had not known, until I experienced the alternative, that silence could have that particular quality, that it could be a form of ease. Her hand was on my shoulder, as it was every morning, and the warmth of it had stopped feeling like the warmth of applied heat and had started feeling like the warmth of something recognized. A warmth that came from a particular source and traveled to a particular destination and belonged to both. My wolf moved, not the breath width of those first days. It moved with the deliberateness of something very large turning over in sleep and beginning, for the first time in a long time, to consider the possibility of waking. I felt her go still. Not startled, she was not a person who startled easily, but the absolute, perfect stillness of focused attention. Her hand pressed fractionally warmer. She said quietly, "I know, I feel it too. And then, it's been waiting a long time. Give it as long as it needs." I did not understand then the full meaning of what she said. I thought she meant my wolf specifically, that she had some healer's awareness of the change below the wound, that she was speaking about the recovery of a physical thing. It was only much later that I understood she had meant all of it, my wolf and the bond that my wolf was beginning to find its way toward. The thing that had been trying to take shape between us since she first walked through the door, which I had been feeling in the way you feel something very new and very true, carefully, at a slight distance, unwilling to name it incorrectly. On the 12th day, she told me about her mother. We were in our usual positions, the chairs drawn close, the fire well built, the gray light of mid-morning coming through the mountain window, and she had been working in her companionable quiet when she said, without particular preamble, "My mother was a healer too. Not herb-keeping specifically, she had something the packs call the wolf gift, though she was never pack herself. She could feel the source of a fever before the fever showed itself. She could set a broken bone by touch without looking. She was extraordinary by any measure." She paused. Her hand moved across the scar with its patient, familiar attention. "She was from the Ashfin settlements," she said, "and the nearest pack never acknowledged her standing. They used her, sent for her when they needed her, gave her what they felt like giving when they felt like it, and spoke of her in the terms you've probably heard used about me in the anteroom. She said this without bitterness, as a simple fact. She didn't mind. She used to tell me the work was the thing, not what people called you while you were doing it. She looked at me directly, in the way she always looked at me, the way you look at a person, not at a role. I minded," she said. "When I was young I minded very much. I thought she deserved better than what she was given, and I was angry about it on her behalf for a long time." She was quiet for a moment. "I understand it differently now. Not that she deserved the dismissal, she didn't. But the dismissal was separate from the work, and the work was what was real, and she was right to treat them separately." She looked at the scar under her hand. "I tell you this because I want you to know that I am not doing anything differently in this room than I do in the settlements, regardless of what the council thinks of where I came from. What I find here is worth finding. That is the only reason I come back each morning." My wolf moved again, more substantially, not the deliberate turn of something large, the purposeful reach of something extending toward wakefulness, toward the source of the warmth it had been orienting toward for 12 days. I felt the bond take shape in that moment with a clarity I had not felt before. Not the tentative, half-formed thing I had been careful around for a week and more. A genuine shape, warm and unmistakable, reaching from where I was to where she was and occupying the space between us. She felt it. Her breath changed, I heard it, the small controlled change of a person who has encountered something large and is deciding how to carry it with appropriate steadiness. Her hand did not move from the scar. We sat in that for a long time, in the quiet morning room, the fire behind us and the mountains working their slow way clear outside the window. Bren came that evening and talked about the season's trade accounts and the state of the lower roads and the young female wolf who had been scouting the pack's eastern border. And partway through his account, he stopped speaking for a moment in the middle of a sentence and looked around the room, and then looked at me with the expression of a man who has noticed something he doesn't have a category for. "The room is different," he said. I looked at him. "I don't mean the fire," he said. "The fire's the same fire. I mean the room." He looked around it again, measuring something by a sense he did not have formal language for. "Something is different in this room, Cairn." I made the motion of yes. He sat with that, then is it her? I made the motion of yes again. He looked at the fire for a moment. He said, "Good." And then, after a pause, "The pack wolves have been calmer this week. I haven't told anyone. I didn't think it needed to be said aloud. It's the kind of thing that either becomes apparent or it doesn't, and I think it's becoming apparent." He left and I sat with what he had said, which was true in the way that the most important things tend to be true, not arrived at by argument or demonstration, but simply present, recognizable once named. The pack took its register from its king. This was not a metaphor or a leadership principle. It was a physical reality, the wolf bond between an alpha and the pack running in both directions, the pack feeling what the king felt in the deep register that was not mood or personality but presence. For 2 years I had held myself in the held-breath suspension of a man not yet dead and not yet healed, and the pack had breathed the same way, quietly and indefinitely, waiting. If the wolves were calmer, it was because something in the held breath had begun to release. On the 14th day, I tried to speak. She had gone briefly to the window to look at the ridge. She did this most mornings, calculating the weather against the road conditions with the practical attention of someone whose work required moving between places in all seasons. I watched her at the window and I thought about all the words I had been holding for 2 years, and I chose the simplest one, and I tried to say it. Nothing came. But something happened around the trying that had not happened before. I felt the mechanism of it, the breath and the throat and the intention aligned toward speech. The machinery moved. It did not produce the word, but it moved. She turned from the window without me doing anything visible. She had always had that quality, the awareness of what was happening in the room without appearing to watch for it. "Not yet," she said, reading something in my face I hadn't known was showing. "But soon." She returned to the chair. "You don't owe me words," she said, with the quiet directness she applied to everything. "Not as a consequence of what I'm doing here. I'm not tending this wound in exchange for your voice. I'm tending it because it's a wound and I can reach it." She looked at the scar. "But I think your voice is very close. I think you'll find it, it's there." I looked at her. I wanted to communicate that the word I was most wanting to say was not about Stoneholt or the pack or the status of my recovery, any of the things a king would logically want to communicate. I wanted to tell her that the word was small and specific and had to do with her, and with the particular quality of the morning since she had arrived, and with the thing that had been taking shape between us in the quiet. I made the motion of yes, not just the habitual small gesture, the larger, slower motion of yes, the one I had been using for acknowledgement of something important. She looked at it, she looked at me. And the honest face she had always had, the face that did not moderate itself for the benefit of a room, showed me something for a moment, just briefly, before she collected it again. Something I recognized because I had been carrying it quietly for 14 days without knowing what to call it. The 3rd week came and continued in its rhythm. Mornings and fire and her voice and her hands and the slow, gathering certainty of the bond taking form between us with the unhurried inevitability of a thing that does not require hurrying. She did not push. She did not name it. She was the least strategic person I had encountered in a life spent among people whose every action toward me had a strategy behind it. And the absence of strategy was so extraordinary, so completely itself, that I did not know what to do with it except feel it and be grateful for it. What she did instead of pushing was continue to be what she was. The same herb woman every morning, the same worn cloak, the same careful hands, the same voice that moved at the same pace whether she was speaking to a king or a farmer's family or herself in the quiet of work. The same willingness to sit in the room's silence without requiring it to become something else. I began to understand in those days what 2 years of silence had given me in spite of everything it had taken. I had learned to attend. Without the ability to fill silences with my own voice, I had spent 2 years developing an awareness of what was in the silences that people occupied, what they were feeling, what they were choosing not to say, what they carried into a room with them that wasn't apparent in their words. Lyarth carried something into my chamber every morning that was not apparent in her words, and that I had been attending to since the first day. She carried a quality of care that was not performed for an audience and was not conditional on outcome. She tended the wound because the wound was there. She came back because she had not finished. The scale of who was wounded was not a consideration. On the 16th morning she arrived carrying something extra in the satchel, a small jar of pale amber, which she set on the stone ledge beside the hearth without comment. She worked as she always worked, quietly and with the same fixed patience, and after a while she said, "Havard stopped me in the lower courtyard this morning." I looked at her. "He wanted to know if I needed anything," she said. "Any materials I couldn't easily find at the settlement. He was very specific and very practical about it. He had a list." A small pause. He didn't say he was grateful, but the list was very thorough. I made the motion of yes, which meant, that is exactly like him. She smiled at that. She had a smile that arrived briefly and without announcement, the honest reflex of something actually striking her as right. "He's a good steward," she said. "He cares about you in the way that someone cares when they've decided it's their work in the world to do so, and they've been doing it long enough that it has become their nature." I thought about Havard, the 12 years he had stood beside me as steward, the 2 years he had stood beside my silence and kept Stoneholt running in the careful, competent, quietly heartbroken way that good stewards keep things running when the person at the center of the thing is temporarily unavailable. He had never complained. He had never suggested, in word or manner, that the situation was anything other than a problem to be managed until it resolved. He had kept looking for solutions because that was what he did, and when the solutions of the trained healers ran out, he had come to me with his careful preamble about a border herb woman and his expression of a man who has made peace with necessity, and I had made the motion of yes, and here we were. Here we were. "Tell him," I said, or tried to say, or moved toward saying, in the way I had been moving toward speech for 2 weeks, the machinery running closer each day to the surface. Nothing came, but Lyarth watched my face for a moment and then she said, "I'll tell him you said so." On the 18th evening, Havard came to my door after the usual hour. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the room, and then he said, "Torvin has asked me formally to record his objection to the continued presence of the herb woman. He would like it in the official account of this period that he recommended against this course from the beginning." I looked at him. "I have told him," Havard said, "that the official account of this period will reflect the decisions that were made and their outcomes, and that I will record the outcomes accurately." He paused. "I want you to know that I told him that." I made the motion of yes. "He is not a bad man," Havard said, with the evenness of someone making an honest assessment of a difficult person. "He is a man who believes that the proper ordering of things is protective, and he is not wrong about that in general. He is wrong in this specific case." He looked at the fire. "He will recognize that eventually. Most people do when the evidence is clear enough." He left. I sat in the fire-lit room and thought about the proper ordering of things, and about the people who are wrong about what needs ordering and what needs simply to be left alone to find its own shape. On the 20th day the fog broke. It had been thickening for a week, the dense mountain fog of late autumn that covers everything above the tree line and leaves the hold feeling like an island cut off from the rest of the world, the passes invisible, the upper ridges invisible, even the nearest timber stands reduced to gray suggestions of themselves. And then on the 20th morning of Lyarth's visits, I woke to a quality of light through the chamber window that was different from any light I had seen in weeks. And when she came in with the rain still in her hair from the walk up from the lower settlement where she had taken a room, she looked at the window and stopped. "May I?" she said. I made the motion of yes. She crossed to the window and stood there for a long time, looking out at the ridge and the passes and the mountains above the passes, all of them visible in the clear pale gold of early morning, the stone bright and the shadows long and the world as large as it actually was. "This is a beautiful place, Stoneholt," she said quietly, not turning. I hadn't seen it clearly before. I was watching her at the window. The light was on her hair and on the line of her face in profile and on her hands resting on the stone sill, and my wolf was present in a way it had not been for 2 years, not stirring, not testing the edge of wakefulness, but present, awake, entirely still and entirely awake and entirely oriented toward the woman at my window, with the certainty of something that has been looking for a long time and has now found. The bond was not igniting in that moment. It was already there. It had been there for days, taking shape in the space between us with every morning's accumulated warmth. What I felt at the window was not the arrival of something new. It was the recognition of what had already arrived, seen clearly for the first time, the way the mountains were seen clearly now that the fog had gone. She turned, she saw my face. She stood very still. "Oh," she said, softly, the sound of someone seeing clearly something they have been partially seeing for a while. I rose from the chair. The movement came naturally, without the careful management of the past 2 years. I simply rose and crossed the room toward her, and she did not move, not toward me and not away, just stood at the window with the mountain light behind her and watched me come with her clear, honest eyes. I stopped within arm's reach of her. The bond was present in the air between us with the quality of something that no longer required any argument about whether it was real. The way the mountains outside were real. The way the warmth in the room was real. I set my right hand over the scar on my left shoulder, the place where her hand had rested every morning for 20 days. Then I lifted it and set it, very gently, over her heart. She was warm. Her heart was beating with the particular quickness of controlled emotion in an honest body. She looked up at me, and her eyes were very clear. "I know," she said, barely a whisper. "I've known for a while. I was waiting for you." My wolf rose, not in urgency or agitation, in the long, full exhale of a wolf that has been waiting 2 years and has found the exact thing it was waiting for, and is no longer in any hurry because the thing it was waiting for is here and will not leave, and the waiting is over. The warmth moved outward from both of us at once, from my hand into her chest and from her chest back through my hand, and the mate bond ignited quietly, completely, like a fire built correctly and given the right moment to catch. No spectacle to it, no announcement. Just the sudden, unmistakable warmth of two things that belong to each other recognizing that they have found each other, and there is nothing further to do but be recognized. She made a small sound. Her hand came up and covered mine where it rested over her heart. For a moment we were simply two people in a quiet chamber with the mountain light coming through the window, the bond warm between us, the world beyond the door entirely unaware. I opened my mouth. 2 years of silence, 2 years of the machinery unused, the voice the wound had taken, the words held unspoken behind my teeth. I opened my mouth, and I chose the first word, and I said it. Lyarth. My own voice after 2 years, rough and low, not what it had been before the eastern reach, but present, here, mine. And the word I had chosen for its return was hers. She closed her eyes, a long moment. When she opened them they were bright, and her jaw was set with the steadiness of someone holding something very large and choosing to hold it with dignity. "Yes," she said, "that's me." The door opened. Havard had been in the corridor closer than he normally stationed himself. He admitted this later without embarrassment, saying that he had been attending to the quality of the room from outside it for days, and had not been willing to be far away on the day he believed would come. He opened the door and stepped in and stopped. He took in the two of us standing together at the window, her hand over mine, the quality of the room, the quality of my face. And something in him that had been braced and careful and disciplined for 2 years came loose all at once, visibly, the way a held thing comes loose when it is finally allowed to. He said nothing. He turned and went back through the door, and I heard him in the anteroom speaking with great conviction and minimal ceremony to whoever was present, and a moment later there were footsteps, more than one person's worth, quick, coming toward the chamber. "Here they come," Lyarth said beside me, very quietly, with the unsurprised quality that was specifically hers. "Yes," I said, my voice still finding itself, still rough, still new to my own ears, but present here. They came through the door, Havard first, and behind him Torvin and Aldrich and Moretti's, and two of the senior pack members who had been in the anteroom for the morning council. They came in expecting the Silent King in his chair by the window, and found the Silent King standing by the window, having recovered his voice, holding the hand of the borderland herb woman from Ashfin. The room went very still. Torvin's mouth opened and did not produce sound, which was, as far as I was aware, a condition he had never previously experienced. He had had a great many opinions about Lyarth's presence in this hold, expressed with considerable confidence and on multiple occasions, and every one of them was currently nowhere that he could reach. Moretti's looked at Lyarth. Lyarth looked back at Moretti's with her customary, undefensive calm. There was a long moment in which Moretti's visibly conducted some interior recalculation, the recalculation of a physician who is good at her work and has encountered something her work does not fully account for, and is now determining what to do with that. She arrived, finally, at the most honest place available to her. "The wound has cleared," she said, not a question, an acknowledgement. "Yes," I said. Another silence, in which every person in the room adjusted to the fact that the Lycan King of Stoneholt had just spoken, audibly, clearly, in a voice that was rough but unmistakably present, and was standing at the window holding a borderland herb woman's hand with the particular quality of a man who is not going to be talked out of anything. Aldrich said, "My king, it is very good to hear your voice." "Thank you," I said. "I have been wanting to use it." I looked at Lyarth. She was watching me with the same clear attention she had always watched me with, entirely without performance, carrying her hand over mine with the ease of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be and knows it. I looked at the room, at Havard, at Torvin, at Aldrich and Moretti's, and the senior pack members who had followed them in. At the Council of Stoneholt, assembled in my chamber, on the first morning in 2 years that I had spoken. I said, "This is Lyarth of Ashfin. She is my fated mate. She will be Luna of Stoneholt." A pause, then, "She was always going to be. That is the meaning of the word fated." Torvin's face moved through several things. He was not a small man in any sense, not in his convictions, not in his opinions, not in his sense of the proper ordering of things and his own position within it. The situation was requiring a significant reorganization of several things he had thought were settled. He arrived, after a long moment, at the place that was available to an honest man in his position, the place where conviction meets evidence that is clear enough to require revision. He inclined his head. "My king," a pause long enough to be meaningful, then toward Lyarth, "My lady." Lyarth received it with the equanimity she received everything. She did not make more of it than it was. She did not hold his gaze to let it land or smile with the warmth of a victor or step forward to claim ground. She simply received it as she received all information that came to her, as a true thing, noted, no larger than its actual size. Moretti said, "I would like the opportunity in time to understand what she did here that I couldn't reach." She said it to Havard, but meant it more broadly. "Medically, I would find it useful to understand." Lyarth looked at her. "I'll tell you everything I know," she said. "Most of it isn't complicated." Havard, at the door, let out the breath he had been holding in some form for 2 years. "The wolves outside the hold," Bren told me this afterward, and I have heard the same account from 4 other sources, all turned at once. The whole pack, every wolf who was in the court grounds and the lower runs and the timber border, all of them turned in the same direction at the same moment, toward the hold, toward the mountain above them. He said it moved through them like a tide drawing back dozens of wolves, all orienting together, and then settling. All of them settling at once, in the manner of a pack that has been waiting for something, and has just been told it has arrived. The pack that breathes as its king breathes. The pack that had held its breath for 2 years and finally, on a clear morning in late autumn, had been given permission to breathe out. In the chamber, after the council had said what needed to be said and gone where they needed to go, and Havard had organized the practical considerations that a situation like this generates in considerable quantity, he stopped at the door as the last one out. He looked at Lyarth for a moment. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has managed a very long and difficult passage and has now arrived at its resolution, and is experiencing the particular quality of relief that comes not just from the ending of a hard thing, but from the ending of it in the right way. "Ashfin Valley," he said, "your family will want to know." "My mother will want to know immediately," Lyarth said. "I'll send a writer today," he said, "before noon." He left and the door closed and the chamber was quiet, the good quiet, the quiet of a room that contains everything it needs. Outside the window the mountains were clear and the light was full on the stone and the peaks, and I knew that the fog would return. It always did in autumn in Stoneholt. But I knew also that it would lift again, and I would be here when it did, and she would be here when it did, and the chamber would be warm. I am telling this now from the other side of it, from the vantage of a man who has had his voice for these months and has been learning, these months, the way you use a thing you have been without for a long time, more carefully, perhaps, than before, more aware of what words cost and what they carry and what the silence around them means, more selective, in the way that a person is selective about what they spend when they understand that spending is a real thing. She told me once, lying in the fire-lit warmth of our chamber with the wolves quiet beyond the window and the mountains dark and close against the sky, that she had known from the first morning that something was there. Not the bond as a named thing, not as a hope or an expectation she was managing, but as a quality of attention in the room, a feeling of something orienting toward her that she had no formal vocabulary for, and so simply carried quietly and tended alongside the wound. "Did it frighten you?" I asked her. The roughness was gone from my voice by then, or mostly gone as things heal. She thought about it. She thought about things with the same patience she applied to everything. "No," she said, "I've always believed in the bond. Not as a certainty that would happen to me specifically, I'd stopped expecting that, but as a real thing in the world. So when I felt something in this room that felt like the beginning of one, I thought, well, there it is, and I kept working." I looked at her face in the firelight. The face I had watched for 20 mornings in the chair beside mine, the face that had never moderated itself for the benefit of being in a king's presence. "What made you stay?" I asked, when Torvin and Moretti's were in the anteroom saying what they were saying on the first morning. "What you needed was what I know how to do," she said, and I could see after the first morning that it was working. "It doesn't take more than that." She looked at me with the directness she had always had. "It was also you. Not just the wound, you." She told me again about her mother, the woman who had worked in the eastern settlements for 40 years and called the work the thing, not what people said while you were doing it. I had been thinking about that in these months, what it meant to believe that, what it required. I had spent my life in the opposite posture, in the posture of a king who understood very well that what people say while you are doing something is itself a form of power, a form of the ordering of the world that cannot be separated from the thing you are doing without cost. I had not been wrong about that exactly, but I had perhaps not understood that there were people who operated outside that system and were not reduced by operating outside it, who brought a quality of attention to their work that the system's vocabulary did not encompass and could not diminish. Her mother had known that. She had raised a daughter who knew it in her bones. I asked her once what she had been thinking when she said the fire was too low. She laughed, the small, honest laugh that happened when something struck her as genuinely funny. "I was thinking the fire was too low," she said, "and that someone should do something about it, and I was the person in the room." That is the most complete description of Lyarth I know how to give. Not the Luna of Stoneholt. Not the fated mate. Not the healer who reached what every trained physician in the Western Pax could not. Not the herb woman from Ashfin who walked into a king's chamber and built up the fire and sat in the chair beside his, and came back every morning for 20 days with her cloth packets and her unhurried voice and her hand over the wound that no one else could find. All of those things are true, they happened, they are part of the account. But the inside of her is a woman who walks into a cold room and builds the fire, not because she is asked to, and not because she expects to be thanked, but because the room is cold and there is someone in it who needs warmth and she knows how to give it. The bond found us in the way that bonds do, through the wound's slow undoing, through 20 mornings of quiet work, through the fire built with intention and the words given without calculation, and the particular silence between two people who have arrived at honesty with each other without making a project of it. Through a wolf that had not moved in 2 years, finally lifting its head in the dark and turning toward the door. I spoke her name first. That is what I hold on to when I think about those 20 mornings and what came after them. Not the council's silence when they heard my voice, not the sound of Havard's exhale, not the image of Torvin inclining his head, or the wolves outside turning together in their clearing tide, or the quality of the light that morning on the mountains finally free of fog. All of those things are true, and all of them happened. What I hold is simpler. Her face at the window in the mountain light, her hand over mine, the room around us warm and quiet and right. My own voice, rough and present and returning to me, shaped into the word I had been carrying without knowing it for 20 days. Her name, said aloud at last in my own voice, in a room where the fire was high and the world outside was clear. That is what I have to give. That is everything there is to give.